Good morning. A very warm welcome from the University of British Columbia. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the lands on which UBC campuses are located include the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the peoples of the Okanagan nations, and other nations. We are here today from many places near and far, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. My name is Ananya Mukherjee Reid, and I'm the Provost and Vice President Academic at UBC's Okanagan campus. As expressed in our President Santa Ona's June statement to the community, and all commitments expressed by several members of the UBC community, our hope is to contribute to a more just academy and society as best as we can. Today's webinar is part of the journey we began with George Floyd's 3 immortal words, "I cannot breathe." Led by anti-racist scholars, students, and activists, universities began some difficult conversations about the denials, erasures, absences, and the marginalizations that characterizes the Black experience in the academy. These conversations suggest an urgency to make tangible and programmatic institutional changes and create a space for increasing the voice and representation of Blackness in the academy. 2 years ago, in my previous role as Dean at York University, we took the bold step of establishing a program in Black Studies. It was not yet a full program, a certificate to begin with, but one that was possible at that time, given some of our serious challenges. We know from many Black academics at many Canadian institutions that Black studies have faced several challenges and continue to do so. However, we believe that it is a different moment now. We need to consider the potential for academic programs like a Black Studies program, not simply from a technocratic perspective, but with an anti-racist lens. Today's event is one step in that journey. I'm delighted that we are collaborating with York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies for the event where I previously worked. And it is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker of today, Professor Andrea Davis. And thanks to CBC Kelowna for the interview they did with her this morning. Professor Davis is an associate professor in Black Cultures of the Americas in the Department of Humanities at York University in Toronto, where she founded the Black Canadian Studies Certificate. She is currently also special advisor on the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies Anti-Black Racism Strategies. She holds cross appointments in graduate programs in English, interdisciplinary studies, and gender and feminist and women's studies at York University. Her research focuses on the literary productions of Black women in the Americas. Andrea is particularly interested in the intersections of the literatures of the Caribbean, the United States, and Canada, and her work encourages an intertextual, cross-cultural dialogue about Black women's experiences in the diaspora. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Horizon, Sea, and Sound, a cultural critique of the nation. I would be remiss if I did not say what a brilliant educator Andrea is, and her many students who I have heard testify to the impact she has had on their personal and intellectual growth. It was the passion of people like Andrea and many of her students that advanced Black studies at York and continue to do so. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Ananya, for that warm introduction and welcome, and for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And thanks also to my colleagues, Handel and Bryce, for sitting with me this afternoon to think through some of these questions. And my deepest gratitude to those of you in the audience who have decided to join us for the discussion. I want to begin today by charting a trajectory of Black studies history in the United States, and to link that history to some of the work we have been able to do or tried to do at York University, to think about the ways in which the work intersects, but perhaps also diverges. The field of Black Studies includes a range of programs and subfields, both national and diasporic and global in scope, including African American Studies, Africana Studies, African Diaspora Studies, Africology, Pan-African Studies, Black British Studies, and Black Canadian Studies. The field is interdisciplinary in orientation, focusing on the histories, cultures, ideas, experiences, and politics of Black people. The first Black Studies programs were created out of the Black political activism of the late 1960s in the United States, as the disillusionment with the promise of civil rights and the nonviolent platform of Martin Luther King Jr. gave way to the more forceful demands of Black power. The Black educational self-determination at the heart of Black nationalism actually laid the foundation for Black studies. The assassination of Malcolm X in 1965 and then King in 1968 both led to an outpouring of anger and grief among African Americans and widespread racial unrest in the United States. It was against this background that the first Black Studies Department was established at San Francisco State in September 1968, 5 months after King's murder. The program gained official status in spring 1969 at the end of a 5-month strike led by the Black Student Union with support from community organizations, including the Black Panther Party. The founding of Pan-African Studies at Cal State, LA, and African American Studies at UC Berkeley 2 years later also resulted from student and community organizing. The demand for programs and departments in Black Studies was actually common in protests and sit-ins in the 1960s, with African American students insisting that their cultures and interests were not being served by the Eurocentric and white supremacist structures of the university. The student organizing at San Francisco State repeated in various ways across the country, with students demanding an increase in Black student enrollment, increased financial aid, and the hiring of Black faculty members. Black students were joined by Asian, Latino, and Indigenous allies who saw Black studies as a first step in a larger agenda for educational, economic, and social equality. Indeed, the creation of the first Black Studies Department at San Francisco State coincided with the creation of the first College of Ethnic Studies. Between 1969 and 1973, over 500 Black Studies programs and departments were created across the United States. While Black Studies programs in the US peaked in the mid-1970s, by the 1980s, they began to decline. One of the major setbacks was a lack of financial resources, with many universities providing Black Studies programs with very small budgets, with faculty members cross-appointed to multiple departments, and with program leads having little autonomy. Student populations have also changed, with a growing number of Black university students in the United States now being first and second generation students of Caribbean and continental African descent, while the numbers of African American students continue to decline, especially at the nation's top universities. It's instructive that in 2015, against the backdrop of emerging Black Lives Matter movements in the US, Canada, and Europe, that students in 80 colleges and universities across the United States mobilized a new Black student movement. Their demands were not dissimilar from those in the 1960s. African American student recruitment and retention was what they were calling for, an inclusive curriculum, increased resources, free tuition for Black and Indigenous students, and safe spaces. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen with you to show you the work and galvanizing that was taking place in 2015. So this website is called the demands.org, and you'll see 80 colleges and universities, including the top 5 universities in the US, and a list of the demands articulated by Black students and their allies for each of these universities. If people are interested, they can take a look at this website at the end of today's talk. I began with this overview of Black studies in the United States to demonstrate that while we're having this conversation in Canada, 50 years after the creation of the first cohort of programs in the US, that the intellectual impetus for Black studies in Canada is not dissimilar from its historical origins south of the border. 2020 is the new 1968. We're having these conversations in the midst of a global pandemic that has made explicit the deep racial, economic, and social inequities in North American societies and across the world. Protests against racial injustice, police violence, and Black death have demanded a social reckoning that universities can no longer ignore. The academy, rather than being exempt from racism, has functioned to institutionalize inequities, perpetuate racial violence, and even profit from the pathologizing of Black communities. When 34 professors from the University of Ottawa can feel that it's okay for them to sign an open letter supporting a colleague who has used historically violent language in the classroom in the name of academic freedom, we begin to understand how deeply embedded anti-Black racism is in the very fabric of Canadian university life. In this case, academic freedom is the antithesis of Black freedom. Academic freedom is Black death. When conversations like the one we're having now are raised about the potential for Black studies programs in Canada, the question that is always asked and will surely get asked today is, why are these programs needed? Which is really another way of asking, how do they benefit white Canadian society? Will white students enroll in these programs? How will they support the needs of the Canadian economy and labor market? The fact is that if we're going to be committed to Black studies programs, we have to admit and accept that these programs are not meant fundamentally to benefit white Canadian society. They are meant to shift the discourse of knowledge and power within and beyond the academy, to make evident the deep ruptures in our social fabric, and to make possible what Dion Brand calls a grammar in which Black existence might be the thought and not the unthought might be. In 2016, at York University, a year after the student movement in the United States and the establishment of the Black Lives Matter Toronto chapter, undergraduate and graduate students demanded meetings with their deans, the university president, and the provost, and called for a more diverse curriculum that reflected the interests of an increasingly diverse student body, as well as the hiring of more Black faculty. It was these demands and the emotional labor of students that brought a group of Black faculty their allies, and the dean, who at the time was Ananya, together to discuss how they might respond to the needs of the students. Out of these conversations, we began the curricular process that would lead to the development of a Black Canadian Studies certificate in the Department of Humanities in September 2018. Deliberately situated in the humanities rather than in the social sciences, the certificate seeks to center the thoughts, ideas, theories, histories, and expressive cultures of Black peoples in Canada, to center Black knowledges as valuable in and of themselves and not as a tool toward anti-racism or anti-bias training. As a pan-university certificate involving 2 faculties, it combines compulsory courses in the departments of humanities and history with elective courses in English, public policy and administration, and the Department of Music. It also allows students to take a practicum course in their 4th year, where they can leverage their understanding of Black cultures in Canada into careers in the public or not-for-profit sectors. One of our students, Aisha Campbell, who is here with me today and you will meet shortly, is currently completing a placement with a Toronto District School Board trustee, and she might want to talk a little bit more about that experience. While the program at York has been successful, with more than 50 students enrolled in 2 years, the project of Black Studies is ongoing, and we now have plans to expand beyond the certificate to develop a major and minor degree program. As we continue to develop these kinds of programs, what do we need to consider? Historian Darlene Clark Hine identifies 5 characteristics of what she calls a Black Studies mind that recognizes the ways in which Black Studies is fundamentally different from other academic disciplines. Black Studies is, first of all, intersectional and is concerned with the interrelationship between distinct categories of identity: race, gender, class, sexuality, geography, and nation, as well as the ways in which these identities reflect specific relations, both to dominant or hierarchical power structures and to each other. Black Studies is also rooted in nonlinear thinking. It is concerned with both the past and with an investment in transforming the present, in teaching and thinking toward a better future, even while recognizing that the struggle continues and that we are not, in fact, on a steady march toward a more progressive, perfect future world. The third characteristic of Black Studies is that it's diasporic and comparative, not bound by a single geographic location. Even a program like Black Canadian Studies has to take into account the ways in which Blackness crosses borders. Black Studies programs then must connect, draw parallels, and chart the continuities and discontinuities between Black and other marginalized groups wherever they are located. It's also about resistance and not just oppression. Black Studies investigates and seeks to understand mechanisms of oppression while making possible forms of resistance, counter-narratives, cultural practices, and belief systems, new kinds of knowledges that preserve Black people's collective and individual humanity in the face of genocidal conditions. And finally, it's about solidarity. Black Studies acknowledges and embraces solidarity with other groups subordinated by power relations, and analyzes the layered connections between anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, xenophobia, sexism, and imperialism. A Black Studies program, therefore, must recognize the importance of studying and theorizing the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and geographical location, and how these intersect with power and affect the lives of marginalized peoples everywhere. It needs to include the study of history, literature, expressive cultures, political thought, geography, and gender studies, not just criminology, sociology, or social work, which often center Blackness as a problem that needs to be solved. It also needs to pull from the professional fields in human resources, journalism, business, and public policy, as well as from the sciences and health, so it can be responsive to the wide-ranging needs and ideas of Black communities. What I have tried to suggest here today is that the creation of Black Studies programs cannot be removed from their historical or intellectual context. The reality is that these programs have been and remain distinct from other academic programs because they have grown out of student-led protests. They were not initiated by university administrators, they were demanded from the university. For Black Studies as a field, the pedagogical and epistemological approaches have always been oriented toward community engagement, social justice, and an understanding of students as whole and multifaceted people, and not just as a source of fees. The fact is that Black students, Black lives, and Black studies remain oppositional and under siege. We may choose to sit in the comfort of Canadian classrooms and think that the issues affecting Black communities in the United States have nothing to do with us. But what the spring and summer have taught us is that these issues repeat across the world in different formations, from the United States to Canada to Nigeria. The formation of Black Studies programs, which have been born precisely out of the kind of conflicts we've seen this year and which of necessity speak back to power, cannot and will not be comfortable or easy. They are created out of tension, protest, and unrest, and in response to deep histories of violence and pain. They are not sexy, they are not safe. They demand boldness and courage, but also humility, a willingness to admit that even when we've tried, we have not always gotten it right. It's not just about expanding knowledges, it's about transforming the core character of the university and the societies in which we live. Black Studies prepares students to not only understand the world, but to see where the world is wanting and to develop the ability and desire to make it better, to connect the university to local and global struggles so that all of us may live free. This is why I teach, and this is why I fight for my students' right to learn and grow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. That was a brilliantly moving talk, as always. It took me back to those moments at York where we began this journey, and also to a moment in my own life when I was a graduate student in Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots, and how hopeless some students felt that the social relations in which they were embedded in the university would actually respond to their lived social experiences outside the university. So we have a lot of work to do, and we'll look to the leadership of people like you to do it. I now want to introduce my next speaker, Professor Handel Wright. Professor Wright is a professor and director of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education at UBC. He is co-editor of the University of Toronto book series, African and Diasporic Cultural Studies, a board member of several journals, including Critical Arts, the European Journal of Cultural Studies, and the Canadian Journal of Education, and has published widely in fields of the Africana cultural studies, critical multiculturalism, anti-racism, curriculum theorizing, and qualitative research, including a monograph, A Prescience of African Cultural Studies, and co-edited books, Transnationalism and Cultural Studies, Precarious International Multicultural Education, and The Promised Land, History and Historiography of the Black Experience in Chatham, Kent, and Beyond. Professor Wright's community work includes membership of the Mayor of Vancouver's Advisory Committee on Black History Month and the City of Vancouver's External Advisory Committee on Equity and Diversity. Professor Wright's forthcoming publications include 2 co-edited books on Black British Columbia and the nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy. Over to you, Professor Wright.
Hello. Thanks very much, Ananya, for that introduction. I want to thank Andrea for her splendid talk and starting off this conversation, and Bryce, who has agreed to serve as moderator later. I want to thank all the folks behind the scenes who have worked to make this event happen. And finally, and importantly, I want to thank all of those of you who have chosen to join us for the conversation today. My talk, and before I do start my talk, I want to say greetings to you from my home in the city of Richmond, which is part of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of some of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Kwantlen, the Tawasan, and the Musqueam. My talk is going to be supplementary to Andrea's. I'm going to speak autobiographically, and I'm going to speak to the local situation. But that is the idea of Black studies in BC and the idea of Black studies at UBC. So something of an introduction that I've titled Becoming Black, or Am I Diasporic Yet? I will admit I had not paid much attention to being Black in my native Sierra Leone. It is ironic but true that since most Black people in so-called Black Africa are Black, our Blackness is taken for granted, and we do not spend much time considering ourselves Black in phenotypical terms. It takes arrival in a predominantly white country to come to see oneself as Black. Although my image text of Canada was indeed of a white country, I was still struck upon my arrival for graduate studies by what seemed the absolute ubiquitous whiteness of 1980s Windsor, Ontario, and the fact that for the first time, I was taken up as and had to come up and had to take up my own suddenly stark, definitive Blackness. My arrival in Canada was the start of my interpellation into Black Canadianness, into being hailed as Black, the start of being sutured into African Canadian identity, of being racialized, of being seen first and sometimes only as Black, and in turn accepting Black as my primary identity. I present this rough cuts paper on Black studies then as a Black academic. For some of us, especially those of us from what V.Y. Mudimbi has called an invented Africa, who were not Black back there, coming to Canada has meant becoming racialized, becoming Black. It meant being brought directly under the white gaze and being interpolated into such new identities as Black, Black Canadian, and African Canadian. So who are African Canadian academics? We are Francophone immigrants from Africa who, as Leopold Senghor declared of himself, speak better French than the best educated Parisian. We are Anglophone immigrants from the Caribbean for whom, as Marlene Nobesi Philip declared, English is a foreign language, a foreign anguish. We are Blacks who can trace their ancestry back as far as the Underground Railroad from the US to Ontario. Black loyalists who became indigenous Blacks in Nova Scotia, Black immigrants from California who became the first settlers of Salt Spring Island, and contemporary African Americans recently hired despite all ads for academic positions specifying that, quote, preference will be given to Canadian citizens and landed immigrants, end quote. We are male, female, transgender, we are straight, gay, and queer. We range in skin tone across the light to very dark spectrum identified by the flustered racist potential white lady in Wole Soyinka's poem, Telephone Conversation. We are an awkward presence in the academy, the other in position of authority and privilege, supposedly misplaced in the middle class and at the front of the class. We are Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic come ashore on Turtle Island. I point to the process of my becoming Black and to the diversity of Blackness of African Canadian academics to give a sense of who Black academics are, and equally importantly, to point to us as a microcosm of the complexity and richness of what constitutes Black Canadians, one part of the Blacks who are the subject of Black studies in Canada. This is not simply a matter of pointing to neutral sociocultural diversity of Blackness, but a hint at the complex matter of representation and of competing, if too often unstated, identity politics and difference, even within the category Black. It is about liquid Blackness, Blackness as floating signifier, Blackness as contested. So on to Black studies as Africana studies. As an African, I am strongly inclined to think of Black studies in terms of the relationship between Black Africa and its diasporas. Even as I specify Black Africa, I want to warn against taking up Africa as simple homogeneous origin of diasporic Blackness, that idealized source and romanticized past. Africa should be conceptualized as quite complex in both its past and present, including its relationship with its diasporas. So the following are a half dozen plus one conceptualizations of that relationship. We can consider it in terms of Pan-Africanism and the work of somebody like Kwame Nkrumah, which is about the political and cultural discourse movement about the unity of Black people everywhere. We can also look at that relationship in terms of Francophone negritude, the work of Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Léon Damas, the Francophone post-colonial rejection of Eurocentrism and insistence on African culture and ways of knowing that a way of unifying Blacks from the former French colonies internationally. We can consider that relationship in terms of post-colonial Blackness, a Black nationalism and independence after the Eurocentric colonial period. We can consider it in terms of Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, a cultural studies theory, slavery-based dispersal of Blackness. We can consider it in terms of African and Black womanism, or more specifically, Stiwanism, which Molara Ogundipe Leslie coined as the social transformation, including women of Africa. We can consider it in terms of Afrocentrism, where Molefi Asante has declared that Africa does not end where salt water licks the shores of the continent. And finally, we can consider it in terms of African continuities, with Martin Bernal's declaration of African cultures having been transferred and surviving in the Americas. To add to the variety of approaches we can have to the relationship between the continent and the diaspora as the foundation of Black studies, we would also do well to think beyond the historical and genealogical as the taken for granted conception of the Black diaspora. Black British cultural studies scholars Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy advocate that we give up that genealogical roots conception, one that is based on roots, R-O-O-T-S, in favor of a geographical reconception of diasporic Blackness, one based on roots, R-O-U-T-E-S. For Hall and Gilroy, identity is not definitive, springing out of homogenized past Africa. Rather, identity is traced in the roots we have traveled to and the lives we live in the here and now. We do not spring whole out of an origin, but are made and remade and continue to be remade on the journey in our immediate circumstances. The result is what Kobina Mercer articulates as an identity of the present place and time that is necessarily hybrid and always in process. Quote, "It's not where you're from," he asserts, "it's where you're at." In our context, this means Blackness and Black studies are about what it means to be Black in contemporary British Columbia, where a very varied Blackness is negligible presence in need of identification and assertion. And we can contrast these two equally viable conceptions of Blackness to, on the one hand, Audrey Zina Mandiela's assertion as a Caribbean Canadian. She says, "Never seen the continent, yet still African by instinct," end quote. And on the other hand, my own African in Canada question to myself, to Canada, and especially to Black Canada. Am I diasporic yet? So on to my next section, Black British Columbia, DEF or DEF-P. Here I want to speak to the DEF initials DEF, or better yet, DEF-P, as the highly problematic way Blackness is ascribed in Canada. I know DEF-P sounds like an obscure hip hop artist, but it's something of a useful acronym I have coined and employed in interviews, talks, and webinars that I am suddenly in high demand to give on racism and anti-racism. By DEF-P, I mean to reference the specific characteristics of anti-Black racism as I see them, namely the D of denial, the E of exclusion, and the F of forgetting, which result in the P, the paradox of invisibility and hypervisibility. And I want to be more specific and say how DEF-P plays out in BC. Historically, Blackness is denied from the start in BC. Blackness could be said to have started in British Columbia by being smuggled in plain sight, in the identity of James Douglas, governor of the colony of Vancouver Island. Douglas was presumed white, but was in fact multiracial. His father was white Scottish and his mother a Creole, a mixed-race Guyanese woman. James Douglas's identity is in effect whitewashed both by himself and much of the official record, in not revealing, let alone openly acknowledging a multiraciality that included Blackness. Through him, Blackness was factually present, but personally and officially erased. His life is in fact emblematic of how BC still treats Blackness. Our historical and contemporary presence is mostly denied despite our existence. We need Black studies to identify and explore BC Blackness, to bring historical and contemporary Blackness into the light. On to erasure. Geographically, Blackness literally does not have a presence in BC. There are no Black ethnoburbs, a curious fact about a major Canadian city. This situation has evolved in part because the Black presence has literally been erased. Hogan's Alley in East Vancouver, which included Black Strathcona, was bulldozed to erect a viaduct, an act which was not just the demolition of buildings, but the erasure of Black community. We need a Black studies that documents that act and its continued consequences. And now forgetting. Demographically, it is easy to forget Blackness in BC. Blacks constitute some 1.2% of the population. The Black community activist Kona Katranya puts it more starkly, and I quote her here. There are about 5 million people in BC, about 2.5 million in Metro Vancouver, 675,000 in the city of Vancouver. Of these, there's a grand total of about 46,000 Black people in British Columbia, end quote. It is altogether too easy to forget that there is a Black population in BC as a consequence of us being a very small and scattered population. We need to establish Black studies as part of a strategy that reminds us of Black presence and gets us out of the catch-22 that says we can't have Black studies at UBC because we don't have a lot of Black folks. And we don't have a lot of Black folks at UBC because we don't have a Black studies. So onto the present context and the urgent need for Black studies at UBC. At the insistence of Santa Ono, who I have taken to referring to as UBC's anti-racist activist president, and with the full enthusiastic support of the chair of the UBC Board of Directors, Nancy McKenzie, the University of British Columbia is currently actively addressing systemic racism in general and anti-Black racism and racism against Indigenous people in particular at our institution. Currently, racism against Black people of the most grotesque kind, especially in the United States, has horrified all of us, and that combined with episodes of racism against Black students right here on the Vancouver campus, largely constitutes the impetus for the work we are currently undertaking on addressing systemic racism at UBC. The problem here is that UBC is starting from the dark ages in terms of the very representation of Blackness. Underrepresentation is acute enough that Black people are an absent presence, at once not here, yet having a significant effect. Black bodies are rendered bodies that do not belong on campus. Black bodies of knowledge, ways of knowing, and approaches to pedagogy are not acknowledged, let alone validated. To start to see and acknowledge Blackness via grotesque racism elsewhere and everyday racism on UBC campus, and hence via very necessary anti-racism work, is, albeit quite inadvertently and ironically, to bypass Black presence and agency that overworked and tokenized Black presence at UBC. It is to reduce Black people to individuals in need of saving, to reduce Blackness to a problem to be solved. As a Black person at UBC, I see the problem of racism against individual Blacks at UBC as a symptom of a much more comprehensive chronic disease of a truly woeful and perennial lack of representation of Blackness. At a minimum, within a general anti-racism frame, there needs to be a robust, more specific component of addressing the deaf P that is anti-Black racism. UBC is one of the largest and most prestigious universities in Canada. It is problematic that we do not have dedicated student scholarships and fellowships and faculty grants on Blackness. It is troubling that Black staff and Black faculty remain so rare as to be distinct oddities on campus, that we do not have Blacks in leadership positions, that we do not have dedicated physical space for Blackness. It is unconscionable that we have no Black studies at UBC. We sorely need Black studies at both undergraduate and graduate levels. We need Black thought and approaches within various disciplines. We need an interdisciplinary Black studies program led by an appropriate chair located in a Black center. We are squandering the opportunity to create a particularly unique Black studies that would be notable internationally. It would be a Black studies comprehensive enough to cover the African continent and its diasporas, some of them double diasporas, from Africa to the Caribbean to Canada, or Africa to the United States to Canada. It would include what Paul Gilroy has identified as the Black Atlantic, touching on the slave trade routes that have resulted in Black presence in Western Africa, Western Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Oh, but UBC is a gateway to the Pacific, some would say, a focus which inadvertently or not amounts to the turning away from an exclusion of the Black Atlantic. So I would reply, why not add the first element that would make Black studies at UBC particularly exciting, namely what scholars like Robbie Shillam and Etsuko Takitani have independently identified as the Black Pacific. Also, what would make UBC Black studies particularly unique? Why not study local Blackness, the denied generations, those descendants of the early Black settlers, the erased partially Black ethnoburb that was Hogan's Alley, the forgotten Black settlers of Salt Spring Island, the invisible emergent Black clusters of immigrants and refugees from Africa in New Westminster and Surrey, and the community-making social media presence that is the Facebook group Meanwhile in Vancouver. I'm encouraged by the fact that parallel to and intersecting with the UBC efforts at anti-racism in general, this event, organized by UBC Okanagan and initiated by Provost and VP Academic Ananya Mukherjee Reid, is an attempt to touch on this larger project of Black representation. To start with, talk about the possibility of Black studies. It is perhaps particularly appropriate that this is initiated at UBCO. To my knowledge and in my experience, it is smaller institutions and the smaller campuses of large institutions that usually have the dexterity and the temerity to speedily and fully introduce innovative programs. For example, despite a good number of academics undertaking what could be considered cultural studies work at their main campuses, at both UBC and University of Washington, it was the smaller campuses, UBCO and UW Bothell, that were able to establish cultural studies programs. While I can easily see UBCO taking the lead, I also believe it should not become the only repository of Black studies, that there needs to be an interconnected Black studies on both campuses. I'd like to end by recommending that Black studies at UBC be characterized by a combination of the modesty of Stuart Hall's notion of Blackness without guarantees and Gayatri Spivak's notion of conjunctural inclusivity. Hall's Gramscian notion means that we should not consider our strategies to always be right simply because of our identity and the fact that our ultimate goal of equity and recognition, in part through the establishment of Black studies, are right. Spivak's notion means that working in solidarity with other progressive people, BIPOC and otherwise, for our related goals. Together, Spivak's and Hall's notion would mean that taking on intersectionality, acknowledging and working with and on the nuances of difference within the category Black, even as we sometimes employ a strategic essentialized Blackness when necessary. Secondly, it means actively working in mutual allyship on alliances with progressive others, taking Audre Lorde's advice to, quote, work on the edge of each other's battles. Normalizing Black presence, including through the establishment of Black studies, is a worthwhile equity and representation goal for UBC. My plea for the establishment of Black studies at UBC is not an appeal to UBC's largesse. Rather, it is an invitation for our institution to recognize that Black studies could potentially be a significant contribution to the larger goal of inclusive excellence at UBC. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that brilliant talk. And I take heart that we are going to build an interdisciplinary bi-campus program in Black Studies with leaders like you. You don't know that I started quoting you as soon as I arrived in BC, long before I met you. The line was, it's hard to be Black in Canada, it's harder to be Black in BC. And that line became so much more meaningful to me when I started talking to my students, our Black students on the Okanagan campus, who felt the erasure and the denial that you talk about in a very visceral way in their everyday lives. And I have to say, like, as always, it is really their passion which drives me to believe that, you know, we can make things happen here. So I will now introduce Bryce Traister, who will moderate the Q&A session. Bryce Traister is the Dean of our Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies and also the Dean Pro Tem of our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And I'm looking to him when difficult issues of program development happen. I expect Bryce to take a leadership role there as well. So over to you, Bryce.
Thanks very much, Ananya. It's a real honor and distinct intellectual pleasure for me to be part of this discussion today. I don't know about any of you 196 folks out there in webinar land, how you felt regarding the presentations that we've heard today from Professors Davis and Wright. I find myself very moved by what I've heard today. Very briefly, I want to make a bit of a confession, which is that it's really only since I moved to BC a few years ago that I became much more aware of how it is that my own experiences as an American who had the privilege of being able to immigrate to Canada many, many years ago, that I brought with me what I think is one of the central alibis that white Canadians will tell about their relation to the Black Canadian experience. And that alibi is that it's not as bad here in Canada as it is in the United States. And it's taken me a while in my personal intellectual life to come to recognize that better. And Professor Davis in particular, I think, called that out beautifully in her remarks for us today. And I think that Professor Wright repeated that important requirement that we, potential allies, and of course, Black Canadian scholars, teachers, and students understand the importance of getting past the problem of sort of visible invisibility that has often become the condition of the Black experience in Canada. And as I say, it is an honor and an opportunity for me to learn a lot from folks like Andrea and Handel in our conversation today. And also we're going to hear from and learn a bit from a student. It's a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Aisha Campbell, who is a fourth-year student at York University, currently completing a certificate in Black Studies. And she's kindly agreed to join us today to tell us a little bit about, I hope, some of her experiences. And so we'll be hearing from her very shortly. In my job as moderator, I want to draw everyone's attention to the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screens. It might show a little number in red indicating that there are questions that are being asked. Please do ask questions, type them into the space, and we will do our best to get to answers for those questions from our panelists today. I will try to keep track of that. You can also participate by upvoting, so indicating your support for a question by clicking on the thumbs up. And we will be kind of working our way through the list of questions that are coming through. So please do not be shy. This is a conversation. It's one that we hope to continue, and your input is really valuable at this time. So I might now ask Aisha if she might be willing to share a few thoughts for us, help us to understand a little bit about the experiences of a student participating in a Black Studies program. Aisha, if you are able to turn your camera on or just unmute so we can hear from you. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And yeah, like Bryce said, I'm a fourth-year York student, and I'm in the Black Canadian Studies certificate. And what I would say to that is that I definitely believe the Black Canadian Studies certificate has shaped my experience at York for the better. York University is definitely one of the most diverse schools in the GTA, but that diversity dissipates as you get into your classes or in your programs. You tend to be one of few Black students in that class. So having the Black Canadian Studies program, that has allowed me to build a network of other Black students and Black professors that have helped me throughout my schooling. Because as much as university is about your academics, it's definitely about endurance and being able to make it to the end of your degree. And it's really hard to do that on your own. So with the fact that I was able to amass this supportive network has really helped me get to the finish line closer. Also, a lot of the experiences that I've gotten that are extracurricular have been through the Black Canadian Studies program. I've had the ability to go and speak on a panel at a conference in Chicago. As Dr. Davis said, I am doing my practicum with the TDSB, so I've also been able to get a lot of experiential experience as well.
That's marvelous. I mean, it just sounds like this is a program that has enabled you to, pursue in a very personal way and a passionate way and important way, an educational experience that, it sounds to me like you're ready to kind of take it out into the world.
Yes, definitely. I've noticed, so my major is in sociology, and the stuff that I've learned in my Black Canadians in the program and the courses that I've taken in this program, whether it be history or humanities, I've been able to apply them in my sociology courses. So that has allowed me to really see like the benefits of the certificate.
Yeah, and actually your reference there to the sort of interdisciplinary nature of the Black Studies certificate at York, I think might be a great way to segue into a question really for both of our panelists that I see in the Q&A has been asked as well, which is your sense of, and this is, both to you, Professor Davis, and to you, Professor Wright, your sense of how to sort of commit the university to supporting trans and interdisciplinary programs like a Black Studies program. Do you have any tips for us for how we can make those arguments effective and develop robust programming that will attract students and keep in view what you particularly said, Andrea, which just really resonated for me, which is that a Black Studies program is not here to accommodate or to, sort of fulfill a certain kind of white ambition for a liberal arts education. But I'd love to hear from both of you about, how you kind of see promoting this really deep commitment to interdisciplinarity as a core principle of a Black Studies program.
Thank you so much, Bryce. And for the person who asked that question, I think that universities have to decide what is important to us and what is it that we want to do in the world. I know that there's a tremendous amount of pressure. I come out of the humanities. I know there's an incredible amount of pressure to prove our utility, right? What contributions do universities and university degrees really make to the world? And I think that we have to continue to push back on that. And programs like Black Studies, like Indigenous Studies, demand that we do that work. And I'm not an administrator. I'm not saying that the university, doesn't need to think about, what it calls sustainability and all of that. But we have to decide what is important and what is the work we want to do. And there are some programs that may be small, may not grow, to thousands of students in enrollment, but they're important to the philosophy, to the role, to the function of the university. And I do think that a Black Studies program, like I said in my talk, has to be interdisciplinary. It has to draw on multiple disciplines, multiple facets of knowledge and knowing and thinking. Interdisciplinary programs are deeply embedded at York, so I don't think that was a problem per se. For us, I come from a department where we have maybe 10 interdisciplinary programs. It might be different elsewhere. But if we want to do something, if we really want to do something, we will find a way to do it. But I think that we need to do it in ways that are committed, not just, let's do this thing quickly so that students will stop talking and shouting, but really think about how to do it well.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bryce and the other attendee. So many thoughts about that. I mean, Andrea has pointed to some of them. When I got to UBC, there was in fact no African studies. So a lot of this is through student work. So the first thing is really, the most important thing is institutional commitment, because there's a way in which either this doesn't get on the radar, or if it does get on the radar, it's done in a very fitful and haphazard and not full-throated way. So in my view, that's what has happened with the African Studies program. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's a small program, it'll remain small because in a way it's starved financially. So what you want to do is have a plan for actually establishing institutionally, that's why I keep saying, let's have graduate and undergraduate Black studies. So there needs to be a plan, and there needs to be funding that is put behind that plan. And Andrea mentioned interdisciplinarity. I mean, I'm a cultural studies scholar, so that is in my bones. So the other thing that happens too is if you hire people in the disciplines and then you say, oh, by the way, then you also do Black studies, those people are doing sometimes double work, right? And sometimes you're happy to do it, but you are doing more work than others might be doing. So how much are we saying that kind of work is worth? So what about the funding? What about institutional, full-throated, substantive commitment to this? What about taking this in an interdisciplinary way, which makes some of it possible? Where both Andrea and I spoke, this is geography and sociology and history all necessarily mixed and taken up at the same time. It's really the only way to do Black studies well. And taking those ideas of Black ways of knowing and seeing how they operate even within disciplines is a start to some of this. But I would not want us to start from, here's a little bit of something that might happen, but let's start with a plan for Black studies and let's have administration behind that plan and funding behind it, and then the establishment of those things, including things like chair positions.
Mm.
If I might,
thank you.
Sorry.
Please go ahead, Andrea.
Bryce, and if we're going to do it, we also have an opportunity to think bold and be bold in ways that we haven't been before. So let's think about interdisciplinary in really innovative and creative ways. So I would love, and I'm speaking to my university as much as I am to you, but I would love to see a Black Studies program that cuts across the sciences, health, environmental studies, the arts, as well as the humanities and social science. And that would be, that could be a really spectacular program that hasn't quite been done before. And there are all kinds of possibilities, I think, that are possible if we really want to do the work.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And as I'm sitting here listening, not just as a fellow worker in the academy, but as an administrator, it does make me think that the kind of administrative commitments to a project like this have to be multi-leveled, right? So it needs to exist at a departmental level, at a faculty level, at an administrative level. It's an honor for me to be at a university where, for example, we're talking right now very robustly about how our tenure and promotion systems, our hiring practices can contribute or not contribute to the development of anti-racist strategies for the contemporary university. So there's work on multiple levels that needs to happen. And I do think that your remarks here are really giving us, outstanding guidance on how some of these questions, we might start answering these questions together. I do want to turn to another question. This one is coming from, I believe, a colleague of ours here on the Okanagan campus, Professor Cho. who's asked a question about the relationship between traditional area studies and post-colonial studies. I think if I might gloss the question a bit to ask for both of your thoughts about how you see, and this is perhaps Handel sort of riffing on Audre Lorde's observation that you've quoted for us, the way in which, you know, the kind of overlapping sort of edges of our various battles, you know, might engage us in some of these questions. How do you see area studies, a Black studies program in Canada interacting either intellectually or programmatically with kind of the current sort of status of post-colonial studies in different humanities and social science disciplines?
Well, first of all, you know, I want to say that this is a really interesting question that troubles a field like cultural studies in which I'm in. Do we talk about cultural studies or do we talk about area studies, and what's the difference between the two? And what I would always advocate is that there's the potential for so-called academic neutrality in ways of doing area studies, where we can do history in the traditional sense. To do an interdisciplinary, and I think Professor Cho is suggesting post-colonial take on things, I would say related to that, a cultural studies take on things, is to begin to get to part of what Andrea said, which is, this is not about a studies that is neutral. This is about advocacy. This is about social justice. This is about representation of the underrepresented. And I unabashedly do that kind of work, which is what attracted me to cultural studies. So that would be one of the main differences. We would want a Black studies that is about being overtly anti-racist. And if it touches on other things, would be about explicit support of critical ways of doing indigenous studies, for example, and hoping for mutuality in that support, right? So for me, the kind of Black studies that I would envisage for UBC would be one that would be characterized by things like that. It would be overtly anti-racist, it would be political, it would not attempt to be neutral, it would go beyond the idea of area studies and crisscross areas to say necessarily, like Paul Gilroy articulated. I mean, I can't talk about Black Britishness without saying how it's affected by Black American culture, et cetera, et cetera. So the cultural studies ethos of reaching across disciplines and seeing what discipline can help you address a particular problem that is in front of you, I think would be the kind of approach that I think the most robust and impactful Black studies would have. And that does include the post-colonial, which is so important for everybody, like especially those from the Caribbean and from the African continent. It's unavoidable that we deal with that post-colonial, or even, as some are stressing now, a decolonial approach, maybe even beyond a post-colonial approach to things.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Handel, which I deeply appreciate and completely agree with. One of the things that I have found at York in, you know, my now, I don't know, many years of full-time teaching is the ways in which the student demographic has shifted and the way in which curricular interests have had to move and be flexible to represent those shifts. So when I started at York, we had a number of very robust area studies, and I taught in one of them, Caribbean and Latin American studies. And we had several other South Asian studies and so on. And all of those area programs, you know, most of those programs, except African studies and East Asian studies, closed. And one of the things that, one of the interventions that the Black Canadian Studies certificate made in the gaps in the curriculum that was revealed by those closures was the way in which Black populations, as Handel talked about, have really become increasingly complex, and that we're dealing with students who increasingly are not new or first generation immigrants, but are second and third generation, who are less interested in interrogating the histories and the the geographic locations from which their parents arrived, and are more interested in what it means for them to live in a place that is Canada. And so that Black Canadian Studies has allowed students from the continent, from the Caribbean, from historical Black communities to find a space in which together they can engage these questions. And that's not to say that area studies is not important. I think that as we develop a major and a minor beyond the certificate, that it should be broader and, include African studies and Africana studies and so on, and be far more diasporic and engage a lot of different histories and so on. But it is important to recognize the political and intellectual work that Black Studies does, and part of that is helping the students who come to it think through complex questions of being in relationship to place and time.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Davis, you're going to help me to pivot to the next question here. I wanted to invite Aisha back to our conversation in relation specifically to the student perspective. We have a question in the Q&A about how one goes about sort of selecting a Black Studies program, or thinking about how you might continue in a graduate studies program, or I would just offer also, do a Black Studies certificate or area of study in relation to another major or minor. I'm wondering, Aisha, if you have any thoughts about that. Dare I ask, are you turning your thoughts towards graduate studies maybe in the future?
Yes, I'm definitely
great
because Dr. Davis is in the room, and yeah, she wants me to do graduate studies. But I can just speak a little bit how I got into the program. So like Dr. Davis spoke in her earlier about 2014 with Ferguson, with the Black Lives Matter movement, how it really inspired people and made students want something like this to learn from, wanted a program like the Black Canadian Studies. And that was definitely something that resonated with my experience after 2014 and Mike Brown and everything. I definitely wanted, when I decided to come to York, to study stuff about me and people that look like me and what it means to be a Black Canadian. And so I did take one of Dr. Davis's course, Cultures of Resistance. And that's when she brought up having the Black Canadian Studies program. And automatically I was like, this is for me, I need to sign up for this. But what makes the Black Canadian Studies program great, at least at York, is that you're able to supplement that with your major quite easily, because you do need to have electives so you can graduate. And the Black Canadian Studies program builds up those electives quite perfectly, so that you're able to do what you need to do with regards to your major, or if you had a minor, and still take this certificate. And so I think it just made like a perfect choice for me. So yeah.
That's thank you for sharing that. I feel like your experiences in how you have come to be the wonderful presenter and young intellectual that you are, is a voyage of discovery. I mean, it is something that you are able to do, but we need in the universities to make it possible for students like you to imagine and to participate in a trajectory that takes you, from your first year into your fourth year, into hopefully graduate studies, and then maybe join us in the professoriate. So for me as an administrator, one of the real potential values for the institution is to work towards the creation of programs like this that will enable the institution to to actually realize excellence through inclusion. by making those educational experiences central to the mission. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A around K through 12 education, and I just wanted to ask our panelists if you have any thoughts about, how might our colleagues in your understanding or experience with the K through 12 systems that you have worked in or know about, how can we help our colleagues in the schools to enable students, I would think, to look for these opportunities, to imagine Black studies as a reason to go to university, to prepare them perhaps to undertake and make those kinds of decisions. Is there any one idea or ideas about that educators in the schools could help do in order to again sort of create that that story that sounds like Aisha is on in what she's learning?
Certainly what I hear from my students, and Aisha can add, is that there is such a gap in the curriculum in the elementary and high school system, so that when students come to my courses at the university, for many of them, for the first time, it's the first time they're having conversations about Black histories, experiences, thoughts, ideas in a formalized setting. They may have had them informally with their friends, but not in a formalized setting. In some instances, it's even the first time that students have had a Black woman educator, right, stand in front of them and represent them. And so we do need to think about how to address that. And I know that it's difficult for, teachers can try to make some interventions. It's not necessarily easy. So more pressure needs to be placed, I think, at the provincial level for governments to make some of these changes. But the histories that we teach need to more carefully incorporate Indigenous studies and Black histories and Indigenous histories. BC might be further along in terms of the history curriculum with Indigenous studies than we are in Ontario. But also English literature. The literatures that we teach should include novels like David Cheriandi's Brother, that are so beautiful and evocative of Black Canadian life. So those are two of the subjects immediately I would think about. I know that there's some schools in Ontario that have made interventions in the social science where they offer a course, on Black studies, but it's not embedded in the mainstream curriculum. And I think it should be there, at least in history and English. And where teachers are bold enough and brave enough and can do it, I think that they should try to make some of these interventions. Aisha, did you want to talk about any of your experiences with the Toronto District School Board, both as a student and as someone working with a trustee?
Yes, I can. So I am an alumni of the TDSB. So I did most of my schooling before post-secondary under the TDSB. So what Dr. Davis just spoke about her class being like the first time that we're really formally talking about Black Canadians and Black history and the Black experiences is definitely my experience. In high school, we never really talked about Black Canadians at all. If we did talk about Black people, it was about Black Americans. And so that's one. And then now that I'm an intern or doing my practicum at TDSB, I am experiencing or seeing the ways in which Blackness is coded during meetings. And a perfect example of the ways that Black students kind of get neglected, even though TDSB is one of the biggest school boards, one of the most diverse school boards, is with regards to French programming. So recently they wanted to disband busing for French programming. But when it comes to the geography of Toronto, a lot of racialized people live in the suburbs and not in the center, where French schooling is quite available. Every other school in the downtown core is a French immersion school, whereas in the suburbs, that is not the case. And dismantling busing would definitely prevent Black students from being able to access this resource of learning a second language. And so the way that they discussed it at the school board, they felt like, oh, Black students don't use French immersion. This is like a quote unquote white thing, which is actually a falsity. Like, Black students make up 12% of the school board, and in French immersion, they are 12%. So this is something that Black students participate, and this is something that they need. And to strip them of busing would strip them of this opportunity to take on this this venture. And we know that if you can speak another language, this would mean that you, when you enter into the workforce, this could up your wage. This can make a difference in your potentiality. And so to take that from Black students, that's literally illustrating the ways that that material wealth can be impacted by the ways that people look at Blackness and their needs. So just seeing that at the trustee definitely gave me a different perspective that I would not have been able to see if I did not do the practicum. So those are just some of the ways that the Black Canadian Studies program have allowed me to see myself and see others that look like me and how we operate in this country.
Thank you, Aisha. It's a terrific, sort of example of the importance of what we sometimes call experiential learning. We're learning in the world and with the world, to think about as we go towards, more direct conversations around developing a Black Studies program here at UBC. So we're running towards the end of our time, and what I'm trying to do is group a couple of questions together into one. So I apologize that I'm not able to get to all of the wonderful questions in the Q&A, but we have a couple now that are kind of directed, I think, towards our class, Dr. Reed, the administrator class. How do we, as administrators within the UBC system, support the development of Blackness studies through hiring practices, through financial arrangements, through the role that administrators can take to enable our colleagues like Dr. Davis and Wright and students like Aisha to believe that there's going to be a place for programs like this at UBC.
You want me to answer that, or do you want Andrea and Handel to say what? Okay, so I will answer that. But one thing I wanted to say about the Area Studies program, having quite a bit of experience with that as well, Area Studies has a deeply imperialist history. So when we now do Black studies or cultural studies in an interdisciplinary way, or Indigenous studies, that moment is gone. We cannot recreate academic traditions rooted in imperialist history. So that gives us both an opportunity that is quite different from what Area Studies might have had at the time that Area Studies programs began to develop. So what can administrators do? I think the first thing I hope that we are accomplishing today is to create hope. As an administrator, first of all, I need to hear of things that I can make help happen, right? So I think today the what I've heard from all three of you is that there are concrete, there are experiences that we can learn from. There are concrete ways to move forward. There are challenges we know which will happen, and we just need to move forward with the goal of establishing an interdisciplinary bi-campus Black Studies program at UBC. And, like the way we started at York, whatever are the challenges, we'll do something, right? It may be a small step first, whatever it is, let's just move forward. That's really the only way we can move forward. And then all of the other steps that are being taken in terms of the hiring practices and some of the program related hires, all of that would come together to help this process. But I also think, in this moment where somehow geography appears to matter a little less, at least for those of us who are in academia, maybe we also build something even beyond just UBC and New York. I mean, the connection we've started today, maybe there are ways in having a global Black Studies campus based somewhere in ether. Maybe UBC can host something like that, but we can collect, different repositories of knowledge, professors, students in one place, so that, we are not alone in what we are trying to do. So I see a huge possibility. But I also know as an administrator, there's always 50 challenges to everything that you want to do. But we already also know some of those challenges, right? So what I would like to do, is just, again, work with all of you, ask the deans to put together some kind of a group so that we know what are the concrete steps through which to proceed. There's no other way but to move, and when the challenges come, to deal with them. But I can say that there's a lot of interest, and we should seize this moment. And I think the activism of our students will not let us rest. So I will call upon everybody to convene so that we can move forward with the project.
Thank you. We are getting towards the end of time. I do want to just put one question now for each of the panelists just to think about. And I think Ananya has given me a way to ask this question, I hope, and it actually is around that question. I'm wondering what does hope look like for you today? As you think about what you've shared with us and what you see for a future for Black Studies in Canada. Who wants that one first?
Well, maybe I can start in a place where there is no Black Studies. I like Ananya's idea of let's be activists, let's do this. So where does hope lie for me? Hope lies in this present moment, in the present president that we have, who I think is explicitly activist, and under whom I think some of this can happen. Hope lies in administrators like Ananya, who can take this and say, let's at least start the conversation, and what can come out of that. Hope lies for me in student activism. It was students at UBC that got us the undergraduate African Studies, and its student support can help, and it need not be from the ground up anymore, but that can be part of the pressure. Hope lies for me in the fact that there's already a Black Canadian Studies Association, and that Black Canadian Studies Association can do some of what Ananya has just brought up. But lastly, for me, hope lies in a group we have not mentioned at all, which is Black activists here in Vancouver who are punching way above their weight in educating people about Blackness, in educating people about the diversity of Blackness, our history, and in addressing issues of racism against Black people. Those are the people that give me the most hope.
Thank you. Andrea.
Thank you. And for me, I'll keep my answer really simple. For me, what gives me hope are my students, students like Aisha, who, is a brilliant student, an A+ student on the dean's roll, all kinds of awards, but who told me that before she came to York, before she did the Black Canadian Studies program, struggled to be engaged in her university degree, and now is a brilliant scholar who I have all kinds of ideas for. And I know that she can live up to and exceed every single one of them. In my 5 years as chair of the Department of Humanities, it's been students who have motivated me, who's made me want to do the work, to sit down and write the reports, to fight with senior administration, to do those battles. It's all been students, and the more they're active, the more they are vocal and loud, then the easier my job gets, because I just have to say to the dean that, you know, we're in trouble, you got to do something, right? And so we need them desperately. We need their voices. I'm incredibly privileged to have the opportunity to meet a new cohort of them every year and to have them teach me and impact my life, to see them in the streets, to see their courage and their bravery, far braver than I ever was at their age, makes me think that we can do a lot. There's still a lot left for us to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Nanya, I'm going to turn things back to you for some closing remarks with my thanks.
Well, thank you, Bryce, for moderating it so beautifully, and to all of the speakers. I won't say much except that, well, just two things. That is, we will move forward and face the challenges as they come, but also to mention what Handel said, that we cannot do this alone. We need to do this with all of the activists in the city, in the media, administrators, city councillors, whoever, and in every space in our communities that we can bring together with the academia to take forward the cause of anti-racism. So thank you again. It's just the beginning of a conversation. We will keep working at it. Thank you.